Greetings! Welcome to Raven's Roost Forge. This is Tate, your host, and today we're going to be forging a flint striker. Let's get started. For today's project, we'll be using 01 tool steel, 7/16 inch thick, which I believe is about 11 millimeters, and we'll need 3 to 4 inches. So I'm just going to be marking off on the anvil with a grease pencil about 3.5 inches or 90 millimeters. And then I'm going to go to the edge of the anvil and make a little divot just to indicate the length that I want. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start to flatten it out a little bit. I'm not going to the full dimensions of thickness and width that I want for the flint striker yet. I'm just flattening out a little bit as a starting point. Next, I'll be working from the rounded edge of the anvil, and I'm going to use that rounded edge as a fuller in order to draw this material out a little bit quicker. So we're just hammering half on, half off onto the rounded edge, and we're flattening out and drawing out this material. This heat, I'm just continuing that drawing out and flattening process. I just switched to my left hand to give my arm a break. So you can see me do that periodically throughout this video where I switch hands. You can see that in this heat, I'm just tightening up the edges and making sure that it's a nice uniform, and then we're going to move on to the next step. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and mark an inch or 25 millimeters in from the edge with my grease pencil, and then I'm going to mark a divot using the corner of the anvil at that 1 inch mark on my steel. And then we're going to take that 1 inch of steel and we're going to draw it out into the handle of our flint striker. Again, you can see that I'm using the rounded edge of the anvil as a bottom fuller in order to make the drawing out process a little bit quicker. This is a little bit more efficient, especially when you're dealing with small stock sizes like this, which tend to lose heat pretty quickly. You can see in this heat I'm using a little different technique in order to draw the steel out. I'm tipping the hammer up on edge a little bit so that I can use the edge of the hammer as a fuller in order to draw the steel out a little bit quicker. Ideally, you would also want to tip the steel up or lift it off of the anvil in between blows to preserve heat, but that takes a lot of dexterity and I'm not quite a master of that technique. You can see I'm going to continue to draw out that material using the edge of my hammer as a fuller, and that leaves little divots in the steel. You want to periodically take a little time to clean that up and make it a little more uniform. If you wait until the end of the process to do that, then the steel is pretty mangled and it's sometimes impossible to clean it up and get everything uniform, thickness and taper and all of that. So you can see in this heat, that's what I'm doing. I'm just kind of cleaning up, making sure that I'm getting out some of those divots and making it a little more uniform. And I want to make sure that I'm building in the taper that I'm looking for. So now I've drawn it out to about the thickness and everything that I want. And I want to begin now forging in the taper a little bit more aggressively. So on this heat, I'm working down that taper a little bit more using a technique where you rotate back and forth 90 degrees on each blow. And if you do this right, it's a good way to draw down material and keep it nice and square. So in this heat, I went back to working on the main body of the flint striker. I switched back to a heavier hammer and I'm just drawing it out and making it a little thinner. So I'm just using the width of my palm to determine if I've drawn the striker out to my desired dimensions yet. So I've just switched to a hammer with a less crowned face in order to start taking out some of the hammer marks and get a nice straight, flat, uniform surface. Here I'm just hammering down the shoulder a little bit at the top of the handle. When I bend the handle back, it'll make a little nicer transition this way. So here I'm flipping the steel up on edge, and then I'm gonna forge in a short taper over the corner of the anvil. When we cut this off the parent bar, then this will give us a little bit of a taper at the end of the flint striker. So on this heat, I'm just gonna forge a chamfer on the edges of the main body of the flint striker. Next, we're going to continue forging chamfers and put a chamfer on the tail or handle of the flint striker. In this heat, I'm going to start adding a scrolled or a curled end to the handle for this flint striker. It makes it look a little nicer, a little more finished, and it also keeps a little point from digging into your hand when you're holding it. In order to get graceful curves on a taper, you have to make sure that the taper is nice and smooth and uniform, and you don't have any lumps or bumps, and you want to make sure that you're not hammering too much in one spot, otherwise you'll end up with flat spots. So here I've gone to the horn of the anvil. I've flipped the steel up on edge with the shoulder up, and I am now starting to fold the handle back around. I want to make a nice graceful curve when I fold that over. I've moved back to the face of the anvil over a radiused edge in order to get that bend a little tighter. Make sure that you don't forge directly over the bend. You want to bend, not forge, because we don't want it to get any skinnier. I'm going to use the last little bit of heat that I've got left to flip it over and continue that bend. If you did your taper right and you have a nice smooth taper, then it will bend into a nice graceful curve without much effort. If you end up with a thin spot in your taper, then that's where you're going to get a kink when you try to make a curve, because the steel is going to want to bend more in that thin area than the surrounding metal. Just a last little bit of fine-tuning how I want the curve. I'm closing it up a little bit here. Next, I'm just going to cut off the parent bar from the newly forged flint striker with a hacksaw. I'm going to go ahead and put my touch mark stamp in there, and then one more heat to get the flatter out and make sure that everything is nice and flat and straight, and the forging should be done on this. Rather than a flatter, this is actually a really beefy set hammer, but it works really well in any case. I'm going to place this in the forge as it cools down. This works like a short annealing cycle so that the metal is soft and able to file when I take it out. This will also help relieve any stresses in the metal that were created during the forging process. Okay, this has had at least a few hours to cool down in the forge. Everything is now nice and cool. I'm going to clamp it up, use the draw filing to make sure we've got a flat face on the striker. And then also I'm trying to remove any decarburized steel from the face before I heat treat it. Now is also the time to do any filing to relieve edges, improve the flow of curves, and just generally make it a little bit nicer and more finished tool. I probably spent between 5 and 10 minutes on the filing just to get things really dialed in how I want them. It's not really necessary, but I think it makes a much nicer end product. Now we are ready for heat treatment. I'm going to use this stainless steel tube as a baffle to keep the direct flame off of the striker. This will allow me to achieve a much more uniform temperature. From the other end of the forge, I'm placing a thermocouple into the stainless steel tube so that I can monitor the temperature throughout the heat treatment process. Although it's not strictly necessary, I don't think, for a tool like this, I'm going to go ahead and do a normalization cycle at around 1550 degrees Fahrenheit. The normalization cycle is completed by cooling the item in still air. The Flint striker was reheated this time to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we're going to quench in a fast oil. With O1 tool steel, you can use a much slower oil, but all I had was a fast oil available at the time. So it goes into a little soap and water with a scrub in order to get any oil residue off before the temper. It's debatable whether or not a temper is needed for a Flint striker. I think temper, at least a light temper, is a good idea to make a tool that's not too brittle. This is totally unnecessary, but I usually go to the sandblaster next to get a nice uniform finish. Even after a light temper, the handle is going to be kind of brittle because it's such a thin piece of material. So I usually clamp the main body into the vise so it doesn't get tempered any further, and then I use a torch to temper the handle all the way back. This way it will bend rather than break if it's subjected to any abuse. So I'm just going to take some 220 sandpaper and then polish up the face in order to remove any decarb from the heat treatment, and then we can give it a test. Here's my little bin of used flints. These are mostly little small chips that are already pretty beat up. So I'm trying to find one that's got a decent enough edge to test out this Flint striker. Okay, let's test it out. You can see here that we're throwing pretty decent sparks. And this is not that sharp of a piece of flint either. So to actually start a fire, you would use a little piece of char cloth like this little square here, and then hold it up against the flint. And that way when you strike it, the sparks will shower down onto it and give you something to light your fire from. Again, this step is unnecessary, but I like to put a black finish on my Flint strikers. So I'm just going to give it a quick scrub, and then I'm going to use some cold bluing to give it a nice black finish. You will get a black finish straight out of the quench just because of the oil that kind of polymerizes onto the steel, but I find that this is kind of ugly. It's not really uniform, so I usually like to clean it down to a bare finish and then use cold bluing in order to get the nice uniform black. After applying the cold blue, you want to wash off any residue and then apply oil or wax so that it doesn't rust. Okay, here's a little closer look at the final product. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and you learned something. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Happy forging, and I'll see you next time.